This is a lecture from Open Tuition. To benefit from the lecture, you should download the free lecture notes from opentuition.com.
We are still dealing with external factors to an organisation whilst assessing its position. But whereas when we're looking at Pastel, we're looking at the macro-environmental factors, what we're doing now is we're zooming down onto effects coming and really just within a particular industry. So what we're looking at is Porter's 5 forces, remember, is industry attractiveness. It's not company attractiveness, it is industry attractiveness. It's applied to industry sectors like the airline industry, the car industry, the mobile phone industry, the book industry, the tourist industry, and so on. And it asks how attractive that industry is. And by that it means how easy is it to earn what I'll call good or decent profits within that industry. And by good profits I mean enough to reward the shareholders and the suppliers of loan capital without any difficulty. But also, if we're going to have sustained success, we have to have enough money also to keep investing in research and development, because the products we're selling now are not going to be saleable in perhaps 5-10 years' time, or even less than that. So we need enough money to keep progressing, really, and improving. Without that, we will not have sustainable success. Porter said there are these 5 forces which dictate how easy it's going to be for us to make a decent profit. And the first, we'll start in the middle. They don't have to be arranged with competition in the middle and the rest around. It can just be a list, but you often see it like this. The first one we'll start with is competition or rivalry. Other businesses in the same sector as you are at the minute, and they are your competitors. And this will range from perfect competition up to monopoly. In perfect competition, there are lots and lots of competitors. It's a very broken up type of business, very fragmented, as the saying goes. And I think you can see there, if there's a lot of competitors, you're probably going to have quite a tough time. There's actually a market price which will be going there, and it's very difficult for you to deviate far away from the market price, and nobody will buy anything from you. They're all working away, trying to bring out better products and so on, and you're having to compete with them and keep on your toes. The monopoly, I think you can easily see, where you're the only supplier, is going to be a much more comfortable position. The great power of a monopolist is they can set the selling price of whatever they want. That doesn't mean things are going to sell. What you're selling can be very price sensitive, and if you put the price up too far, you will extinguish all demand, but at least you have some freedom usually to vary the price. Generally speaking, people will vary the price to try and maximize their profits. Remember, just because you're a monopolist doesn't mean you are bound to make a profit. Profits are not guaranteed. You could be a monopoly supplier of something nobody wants. However, if this is not so good and this one here is good, what you would like to do as a strategy is move that way. The more towards a monopoly you move, then the less irritating competitors there are going to be. And the way you can move towards monopoly is, say, by takeover. Take over some of the competitors, knock them out of the market. But of course governments are onto that. They are aware that powerful monopolies can be bad for consumers. But until you get to particular breakpoints, you can nevertheless knock out some of the competitors by takeover. You could knock them out of the business by perhaps dropping your selling prices. If you had a lot of cash in the bank, you could perhaps afford to drop your selling price and the weaker competitors couldn't afford to follow you, and they have to leave the market. In some industry, the way they move towards monopoly is by shooting their rivals. So if you are an illegal drug dealer, then of course it's very common to get rid of the opposition by simply killing them. But I'm not suggesting that in this exam. Next, we can look at potential entrants. So potential entrants are firms who are not in the business yet, but they're looking at you, looking at your business, looking at the industry sector, and they're thinking of coming into it because it looks profitable. These people are real nuisances, because when a new business a new company comes into an industry, it wants to come in with a splash. So it comes in with lots and lots and lots of promotion and adverts. It comes in with special offers and so on to try to entice some of your customers away. And then you feel you have to respond to these special offers and so on. They are a real kind of pain. What we're looking for here is a barrier to entry. And people talk about low and high barriers to entry into an industry sector. So, examples of high barriers to entry is high capital expenditure. None of these usually make it impossible to enter, but high capital expenditure means you're going to have to go out and raise a lot of capital, and there's certain risks in doing that, so on. It may be difficult to raise that capital. It's a bother. Another one is if the industry you're in has got high know-how. So if you're in a very complex industry, then of course the potential entrant learning how to make a success of that business, there are considerable risks in there, and that may well deter them. The risk of failure is simply too great. Sometimes there can be regulation. So, regulations, licensing only certain people to be in the business can keep out potential entrants. So, in many countries, the telephone operations are licensed by the government. They allocate certain bandwidths and so on, and there may be only four telephone license holders allowed. And then, of course, this is a very good barrier to entry. In some situations, governments may allow a single supplier, a monopoly kind of situation, maybe like the post office, and that's great, provided you're in. So anything which helps to keep out your potential entrants coming in and being another rival is very good. Low barriers to entry mean it's very easy to go into the business, try it out. If it doesn't work, you kind of get out of it again without losing too much. Buyers. If you have one buyer who takes 80% of your output, then that is an awkward situation. That buyer who can come along and say, I want the selling price to be dropped by 20%, and you may feel you have to do it, because if you lose that buyer, then you're going to be facing great financial difficulty. What you want to try and do for these buyers is, first of all, it's nice to have many, or certainly not undue reliance on one buyer. And then what you quite like to do is to put in what are called switching costs. Something which makes it awkward, not necessarily money, but it could be money, but at least awkward for the buyer to switch. So, it used to be in the UK many, many years ago now, we had our 4 mobile phone companies, and if you were with one and you wanted to switch to another, you lost your mobile phone number. And of course that was a great switching cost to people, because you then had to go around and inform all your friends of your new phone number, and of course some of them would forget it and so on. And I mean, that's not there anymore. You're allowed to take your phone number with you. But that's an example of a switching cost. Another way in which you can do it, which is essentially a switching cost as well, is to provide the buyer, your customer, the really, really good service. So if they were to switch somewhere else, they run the risk of, in a way, messing things up, that the new supplier will not supply such a good service, or at any rate goes through a kind of learning process before things settle down to their old efficiencies. You can try to tie them in. So instead of living from month to month, why not offer them maybe a 3-year contract? Stay with me for 3 years and we'll give you a discount. You might rather have the certainty of always having that buyer and taking a little bit off the selling price, rather than having this risk that this buyer is going to abandon you. On the other side, we have our suppliers, and of course the worst one is a monopoly supplier. If there's one supplier of a unique component, that supplier can charge almost anything they want and you have to pay it. So you don't, if you can help it, you want to multi-source. And maybe 4 suppliers, and you can play one off against the other. And they're all kept on their toes, keep the prices down, keep the quality up and so on, because they know you might abandon them. Again, you can have a tie-in. If you're worried about the supplier deciding not to supply you anymore, or putting their price up too much, then maybe ask them, could I enter into a 3-year contract with you to supply? And at least you can kind of rest easy for the 3 years. If you think the supplier is at a real risk, and this kind of monopoly one here, risk not only of failing, but maybe at risk of takeover by one of your competitors. And once your competitor buys this unique supplier, then the competitor says, I'm not going to supply you anymore. Well, what you can do, what you might consider, is a takeover. Take over the supplier, bring it in-house. And if you do that, then of course you have got assurance of supply. There are certain disadvantages, which we'll see later, but you have at least assurance of supply. And of course you could cut out your rivals from this. You could say, I'm not going to supply you with parts, and you could bring a great lot of pressure to buy on your rivals. Substitutes. Substitutes are products or services which, in a way, ultimately deliver the same, but with radically different methods. So I would say that as a substitute, you have, well, almost 3 substitutes really. You have got conventional telephones, who for many, many decades had the ground to themselves, really. And then we had mobile phones. And mobile phones had a fairly low barrier to entry because they didn't have to run copper cable into everybody's homes there. They just had to put up masts around the place. So that really hurt the traditional telephone business. And of course we have now things like VoIP, Voice over Internet Protocol, something like Skype, which offers another way in which you can telephone friends at very often zero cost at all. Now these use different technologies, but they all essentially accomplish the same outcome, in that you can telephone people, you can talk to people on a remote basis. Not a lot you can do about substitutes. They tend to pop out of the blue. They're often not anticipated over very many years. And then suddenly there's some sort of a technological breakthrough, and suddenly you find there's a big substitute. So other sort of substitutes would be e-readers versus conventional books. Another sort of substitute, it's not quite perfect, but be able to watch something on Netflix perhaps, rather than going to the local cinema. Those are kind of substitutes, or at least partial substitutes, and we have to be alert to those. But the only way you can kind of cope with a substitute is kind of saying me too. So quite a lot of conventional phone companies also have a mobile network. And of course, quite a lot of conventional phone numbers also supply the broadband, the ADSL cables. And so they make out of, they're making money out of that, which partially compensate them for what they're losing on the VoIP technology. So remember, if you're asked to do a competitor assessment, or what is the competitive environment, the competitive environment is hinting at Porter's 5 forces. It's a simple model. It's a very, very useful model indeed. It has in the past come up very frequently, or parts of it has come up very frequently in P3 questions. Remember, you don't have to be able to say anything about all 5 of those. The question might say nothing about substitutes at all. It may say very little about suppliers. That's no reason at all why you couldn't use this model to say something about competition and rivalry. Maybe there's a potential entrant from abroad threatening to come into the market, and maybe we're worried that they might steal some of our buyers' business here. Is there any way we could tie our buyers in for at least a few more years to keep maybe this potential entrant at bay?